Stay dead. There's no shame in saying you've lost a step.
Q. 007.
England.
Know when you would likely die. The two survivors.
Skyfall, 2012. This analysis begins by examining the film's profile and historical context. Released in 2012, Skyfall celebrated the 50th anniversary of the James Bond film series, which started with Dr. No in 1962. Unlike the previous two films, Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, which formed a continuous narrative arc centered on the Quantum Organization, Skyfall was conceived as a standalone adventure that broke away from the ongoing storyline to focus on the core relationship between Bond and his superior, M. The film was directed by Sam Mendes, an Academy Award winner for American Beauty, and cinematography was handled by Roger Deakins, who is noted for his visual elegance and masterful use of shadows. The budget ranged between $150 and $200 million, and at the box office, Skyfall grossed $1.109 billion, becoming the first and only Bond film to surpass $1 billion until No Time to Die. It also holds the distinction of being the first Bond film screened in IMAX venues. Production faced significant delays due to the 2010 bankruptcy of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. Once production resumed, Sam Mendes and screenwriters John Logan, Neil Purvis, and Robert Wade crafted a script that directly addressed the obsolescence of traditional espionage in the age of cyberterrorism. This thematic concern with aging and relevance runs throughout every frame of the movie. The film opens in Istanbul, where Bond, played by Daniel Craig, pursues a mercenary named Patrice who has stolen a hard drive containing the identities of NATO agents embedded in terrorist organizations. During a fierce fight on top of a moving train, M, played by Judi Dench, orders Field Agent Eve, portrayed by Naomi Harris, to take a shot. Eve hits Bond, who falls into a river and is presumed dead. Following this pre-title sequence, the first act, titled The Fall, shows M coming under political pressure from Gareth Mallory, played by Ralph Fiennes, to retire. While preparing for a government inquiry, MI6's headquarters are hacked and exploded in a devastating terrorist attack. Bond, who who had used his presumed death to retire and find himself in various tropical locations, returns to London. Upon his return, Bond fails both psychological and physical examinations. The evaluators describe him as suffering from a pathological rejection of authority based on unresolved childhood trauma. Despite these failures, M reinstates him as an active agent because she trusts him above all others, demonstrating the deep maternal bond that defines the film's emotional core. The second act, The Hunt, begins with Bond tracking Patrice to Shanghai. The Shanghai sequence, shot by Roger Deakins, is a masterpiece of neo-noir visual storytelling. Bond fights a henchman in a high-rise building, with both men reduced to silhouettes against giant glowing digital advertisements, creating a dreamlike and disorienting atmosphere. From Shanghai, Bond follows leads to Macau, where he encounters floating casinos surrounded by dragon-lit waters. This imagery combines opulence with impending doom. There he meets the enigmatic Severine, played by Berenice Marlowe, a woman trapped in service to a dangerous employer. She guides him to her boss, Raul Silva, portrayed by Javier Bardem. Silva is a former MI6 agent turned cyber-terrorist, seeking revenge against M for betraying him years earlier. When Bond and Silva finally meet face-to-face, Silva delivers a long, unsettling monologue that establishes him as one of the most psychologically complex villains in Bond history. His disfigured jaw, the result of a failed cyanide suicide attempt after being tortured by the Chinese, is a constant physical reminder of M's betrayal. Silva kills Severine without hesitation, demonstrating his complete lack of empathy. However, Bond has already triggered a beacon, leading MI6 to Silva's location. Silva is captured, but this is exactly what he wanted. He allows himself to be taken because his true plan requires being inside MI6's new underground bunker. Once inside MI6, Silva's laptop, which he deliberately left connected to the system, begins hacking MI6's mainframe. Q, played by Ben Whishaw in his first appearance as the young quartermaster, realizes too late that he has been outsmarted. Silva escapes custody and begins a shooting rampage inside MI6, targeting M specifically. The third act, The Homecoming, sees Silva attempting to kill M at a public government inquiry. Bond arrives just in time to rescue her, but he realizes that Silva's cyber capabilities make any technologically secured location vulnerable. Bond therefore decides to abandon all modern technology and take M to the one place he believes is safe from digital attacks: Skyfall, his childhood home in the Scottish Highlands. Skyfall is a desolate, aging estate with no internet connection, no satellite uplinks, and no modern security systems. It represents Bond's past, his origins as an orphan, and the trauma that shaped him into a spy. The journey to Skyfall is a regression to the womb, a return to the site of his parents' death to confront his deepest fears. Waiting for them at Skyfall is Kincaid, the aging gamekeeper played by Albert Finney. Kincaid provides old-fashioned weapons, knowledge of the grounds, and a gruff paternal presence. Together, Bond and Kincaid rig the old house with improvised booby traps using hunting knives, gas canisters, and simple explosives, rejecting high-tech gadgetry entirely. Silva arrives with a small army of mercenaries, having tracked Bond and M using old-fashioned methods rather than cyber tracking. The final battle is lit predominantly by fire from burning buildings and gas explosions, contrasting sharply with the sterile blue light of the MI6 bunker. The burning house against the dark Scottish moors is a striking visual metaphor for the destruction of Bond's past. During the battle, M is mortally wounded by a gunshot. Bond, in hand-to-hand combat, kills Silva by driving a knife into his back, mirroring the way Silva had killed others throughout the film. This is not a high-tech victory, but a primal, physical one. Bond returns to the old chapel where M lies dying. M dies in Bond's arms, reciting parts of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Ulysses. Though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. Her death is the emotional climax of the entire film, and Judi Dench's performance as M remains the emotional core of Skyfall. She had played the role for 17 years. The character of James Bond in this iteration is no longer the invincible hero of the Sean Connery or Roger Moore eras. He is aging, physically failing his pull-up tests, and psychologically scarred. The film explicitly deconstructs the myth of the super spy. This is a Bond who loses everything he ever owned and faces his own mortality directly. M, whose full name is revealed as Olivia Mansfield, is portrayed as a three-dimensional figure haunted by her sins. Unlike previous entries where she barked orders from behind a desk, Skyfall shows her vulnerability and her guilt. Her famous recitation of Ulysses serves as both a defense of the old guard and an admission of her own weakening state as a leader. Raul Silva functions as a dark mirror of James Bond. He is a former MI6 agent who was once a favorite of M, just as Bond is. He was betrayed for what M called the greater good, left to be tortured by the Chinese for months. The film strongly suggests that Silva and Bond are twin brothers from different mothers, both orphans created by the spy game, yet one chose loyalty and the other chose revenge. Silva repeatedly calls M mother or mommy throughout the film. This maternal dynamic is central to understanding his motivation. He does not want world domination or vast wealth. He wants a personal, intimate confrontation with M. As he says directly, he wants a death scene with her. His revenge is not political but deeply psychological. An anagram theory circulating online suggests that Silva's message to M, "Think on your sins," anagrams to your son Iasenti in HK, Hong Kong. Whether intentional or not, the film heavily implies a maternal betrayal. The climax in the chapel feels less like a spy shootout and more like a dysfunctional family intervention. M's sin is utilitarianism, sacrificing an individual to save 6 others. The central thematic conflict of Skyfall is the clash between traditional espionage and modern surveillance. The old is represented by Bond's physical strength, the Aston Martin DB5 with its ejector seat, the Walther PPK handgun, and a simple hunting knife. The new is represented by Silva's cyber attacks, his hacking abilities, and the reliance on computer servers. The film famously deconstructs this theme when Q hands Bond a simple radio transmitter and a gun, lamenting that exploding pens and other classic gadgets are relics of the past. Q says, "What did you expect, an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore." Ironically, it is Silva's mastery of code that nearly wins the day, and Bond must retreat to the pre-digital isolation of Scotland to win physically. Roger Deakins' cinematography has been universally praised by critics for elevating Skyfall to high art. The Shanghai sequence uses silhouettes against glowing digital advertisements to create a neo-noir aesthetic. The Macau floating casino combines opulence with impending doom. Every frame is composed with careful attention to color, light, and shadow, making the film visually distinct from any other Bond entry. The final battle at Skyfall Lodge is lit predominantly by fire, using practical light sources rather than artificial studio lighting. This contrasts with the sterile, blue light of the MI6 bunker and the warm, golden light of the Macau casino. The burning house against the Scottish moors is a striking visual metaphor for the burning away of Bond's past and his rebirth as a different kind of agent. Adele's theme song for Skyfall, co-written with Paul Epworth, won an Academy Award for Best Original Song. Its orchestral swell and melancholic melody directly recall the classic Shirley Bassey era of Goldfinger. The lyrics, "This is the end/hold your breath and count to 10, perfectly align with the film's mission to honor the past while forging a new future for the franchise. Thomas Newman's musical score also won an Academy Award for Best Original Score. Newman incorporates the classic James Bond theme, but subverts it with melancholic strings and electronic elements. The score reflects Bond's internal state, fractured, aging, but still capable of heroism. The music during M's death scene is particularly moving, using silence and restraint to heighten the emotional impact. Skyfall received widespread critical acclaim. On Rotten Tomatoes, it holds a 92% certified fresh rating, with the consensus stating, "It introduces more complexity and gravitas to the franchise while keeping its soul." On Metacritic, the score is 81, indicating universal acclaim. On Allociné in France, the press rating was 4.3 out of 5. At the Academy Awards, Skyfall won Best Sound Editing and Best Original Score. It was also nominated for Best Cinematography, Best Original Song, and Best Sound Mixing. At the BAFTA Awards, it won Best British Film and Best Original Music. These accolades reflect the film's success as both a commercial blockbuster and an artistic achievement. The legacy of Skyfall is that it proved a 50-year-old franchise could compete with the psychological depth of films like The Dark Knight. It re-established the family dynamic of MI6, bringing back Q, Moneypenny, and M in new forms after they had been stripped away for the gritty reboot era. It remains the highest-grossing Bond film of all time in the United Kingdom. The film is structured like a death and rebirth ritual. Bond is killed in the pre-title sequence, symbolically resurrects by crawling out of the dark river, and finally dies to his old self when M perishes. Her death allows for the complete reboot of the supporting cast. Moneypenny returns as a secretary rather than a field agent, and Mallory becomes the new M. Gareth Mallory's transformation is significant. He begins the film as a bureaucratic threat to M, a government man who wants to force her into retirement. By the end, having witnessed her sacrifice and courage, he adopts her role and her mantle. When Bond enters his new office and says, "I sometimes miss the old M," the new M replies, "So do I." This creates continuity and respect for what came before. Moneypenny's arc is also carefully developed. She is the field agent who shot Bond at the beginning, and she carries guilt for that action. By the end, she chooses to leave field work and become M's secretary, a role that classic Bond fans will recognize from earlier films. When Bond asks for her first name, she replies, "Just Eve," establishing their familiar, flirtatious relationship. The Aston Martin DB5 makes a memorable appearance. Bond retrieves it from his garage in Scotland, and it is equipped with the classic gadgets from Goldfinger: machine guns, an ejector seat, and oil slicks. However, the car is ultimately destroyed in the battle. This destruction symbolizes the end of the old Bond era and the necessity of moving forward into a new one. Interesting production trivia adds depth to the film. The role of Kincaid, the groundskeeper, was originally written for Sean Connery to return as a non-Bond character. Director Sam Mendes vetoed the idea, believing it would be too distracting for the audience. Connery had retired from acting, and Mendes felt a cameo would undermine the film's emotional seriousness. In the Komodo dragon pit scene, Daniel Craig wears strange-looking gloves. This was because the original shoot used gloves for style, but the plot required Bond to use a palm-print-activated gun. In post-production, the gloves were digitally removed via CGI to fix the logic error. This small detail shows the level of attention given to continuity. Bond gets shot on screen in this film, which is a rarity. It is only the second time in 50 years, after Thunderball, that Bond is actually shown suffering a gunshot wound. This emphasizes the film's commitment to showing Bond's vulnerability and mortality. He is not a superhero but a man who bleeds, fails, and ages. The theme of home and belonging runs throughout Skyfall. Bond has no real home. MI6 is his family, and M is his mother figure. When MI6 is destroyed and M is killed, Bond must find a new sense of purpose. The film ends with him standing on a rooftop overlooking London, ready to continue serving, but now under new leadership and with a new understanding of his own limits. Silva's physical appearance and performance are deliberately unsettling. Javier Bardem's bleach blonde hair, his soft voice, and his sexually ambiguous overtures toward Bond create a villain unlike any other in the series. When he strokes Bond's leg and face during their first meeting, he breaks traditional masculine codes of the Bond franchise. This makes him unpredictable and deeply threatening. The film's treatment of aging is honest and unflinching. M is old, forgetful, and physically weak. Bond is past his prime. The old Aston Martin breaks down. Kincaid is too frail to fight effectively. Yet all of these characters prove that experience, loyalty, and wisdom still have value. Skyfall argues that obsolescence is not the same as uselessness. The inquiry scene where M defends MI6 is one of the film's finest moments. She recites Tennyson not to a room of allies, but to hostile bureaucrats who want to dismantle her life's work. The poem's lines, "to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield," become her epitaph. Judi Dench delivers the speech with a mixture of defiance, fatigue, and quiet nobility. Silva's plan is unusually personal for a Bond villain. He does not steal nuclear weapons or threaten entire cities. Instead, he engineers a situation where he can kill M in front of Bond, making Bond watch. His victory condition is not global domination, but psychological revenge. This makes the final confrontation feel intimate rather than epic. The film's title, Skyfall, operates on multiple levels. It refers to the name of Bond's ancestral home, a place of childhood trauma. It suggests the falling of the sky, an apocalyptic image of the old world collapsing. It also evokes the falling of M, the maternal figure who has protected Bond throughout his career. When the sky falls, Bond must learn to stand alone. The destruction of MI6 headquarters early in the film is a shocking image. The building, which has been a symbol of British intelligence since the early Bond films, explodes and collapses into the Thames. This visual destruction mirrors the thematic destruction of the old espionage order. A new MI6 will have to be rebuilt from the ashes. Silva's capture and escape sequence is a masterclass in tension and misdirection. The audience believes Bond has won when Silva is handcuffed and brought into MI6. But Silva has planned everything. His laptop hacks the system, every door opens for him, and he walks freely through the building shooting guards. Bond and M become the hunted rather than the hunters. The Scottish Highlands setting for the final act provides a stark contrast to the urban environments of Istanbul, London, Shanghai, and Macau. The open moors, gray skies, and ancient stone buildings evoke a sense of timelessness. Technology is useless here. The battle becomes primal, men with guns and knives fighting over a wooden house that is burning to the ground. The relationship between Bond and Kincaid adds warmth to the final act. Kincaid knew Bond as a boy after his parents died. He calls him James rather than Bond, humanizing the character. Their banter about old times and their cooperation in setting traps creates a surrogate father-son dynamic that contrasts with the destructive mother-son dynamic between Silva and M. M's death scene is filmed with remarkable restraint. There is no dramatic music swelling as she dies. Instead, there is silence and the sound of wind. Bond holds her hand and says, "I got some blood on your face." She replies, "We all have blood on our faces." Then she dies. This quiet moment is more powerful than any explosion or gunfight. The final shot of the film shows Bond standing on a rooftop overlooking London, then walking into M's old office to meet the new M. He says, "With respect, sir, I prefer the old M." The new M replies, "So do I." Bond then opens the door to Moneypenny's office, and she asks, "What are you waiting for, James?" He smiles. The cycle continues, but everything has changed. Skyfall is not merely an action film, but a meditation on aging, relevance, loyalty, and family. By destroying MI6, killing M, and forcing Bond to go home, Sam Mendes performed a necessary surgery on the franchise. It honors the traditional folktale roots of 007 while injecting a painful, modern humanity into the character. For audiences and critics alike, Skyfall remains the gold standard of the 21st century Bond era. The opening shot of Skyfall is a slow, deliberate reveal of a dark corridor, immediately establishing the film's commitment to shadow and atmosphere over pure spectacle. Bond emerges from the darkness not as a triumphant hero, but as a figure already weary, already carrying the weight of years of violence. The camera follows him with a restless energy that suggests danger lurks around every corner, a directorial choice by Sam Mendes to unsettle the audience from the very first frame. This initial sequence in Istanbul is shot with handheld cameras, creating a documentary-like immediacy that contrasts sharply with the polished, studio-bound aesthetic of earlier Bond films. The mission involves recovering a hard drive containing the names of undercover agents, a plot device that grounds the story in post 9/11 anxieties about infiltration and betrayal rather than fantastical world domination. Bond's pursuit of Patrice across rooftops, through marketplaces, and onto a moving train showcases Daniel Craig's commitment to performing his own stunts, lending visceral authenticity to every leap and crash. The fight atop the train is brutally efficient, lacking the choreographed elegance of Roger Moore-era brawls in favor of desperate, ugly close-quarters combat. When Eve is ordered to take the shot, M's hesitation before giving the command reveals her internal conflict between protocol and her personal affection for Bond, a conflict that will define the entire film. The bullet strikes Bond squarely, and his fall into the river is filmed in slow motion, transforming a moment of failure into something almost operatic in its tragedy. Water has always symbolized death and rebirth in cinema, and Bond's submersion serves as a baptism that will wash away his former identity. The pre-title sequence ends not with a triumphant Bond pose, but with a flat line on a medical monitor, telling the audience that this film will subvert every expectation they have about the franchise. This cold open runs nearly 15 minutes, longer than any previous Bond film, signaling that Mendes is interested in storytelling rhythm rather than rapid-fire action. The silence after Bond hits the water is broken only by Adele's voice beginning the title song, a transition that feels less like a conventional segue and more like a funeral dirge. By killing its hero in the first act, Skyfall announces itself as a film about mortality, about what happens after the legend falls, and about whether resurrection is truly possible for a man made of broken parts. The title sequence designed by Daniel Kleinman is a hallucinatory journey through Bond's subconscious, using imagery of drowning, sinking, and being pulled into dark depths. Blood, water, and oil mix together in swirling patterns that evoke both the opening fall and the psychological turmoil Bond will endure throughout the runtime. Silhouetted figures of women with knives, guns, and chains suggest that the female characters in this film are not mere ornaments but potential threats, a promise the narrative only partially fulfills. Adele's voice cracks with emotion on certain notes, particularly the line, "Let the sky fall," as if the singer herself is mourning something lost. The visual of Bond sinking through a field of shattered glass mirrors his fragmented psyche, each shard reflecting a different version of himself that no longer fits together. Cryptic symbols flash across the screen, including the address of Bond's childhood home, foreshadowing the third act's return to Skyfall long before the audience understands its significance. The color palette shifts from cold blues and blacks to warm golds and reds, suggesting the transition from death to life, from despair to the possibility of redemption. M's face appears superimposed over Bond's drowning body, reinforcing her role as the maternal figure who both saves and condemns him. Silva's disfigured jaw is briefly glimpsed among the chaos, an Easter egg for attentive viewers that the villain has been present in the film's DNA from the very beginning. The title sequence lasts nearly 4 minutes, longer than most Bond title sequences, because Mendes understood that the audience needed time to process the emotional weight of Bond's apparent death. When the sequence ends, the film cuts not to a glamorous location but to a stark, gray London, drained of color and vitality. This anti-glamour approach continues the franchise's post-Casino Royale commitment to realism, rejecting the fantasy elements that had accumulated over 5 decades. The typography of the title card is simple, elegant, and slightly cracked, as if the word itself has been damaged by the film's events. Each viewing of the title sequence reveals new details, making it a work of art that rewards repeat analysis rather than a disposable montage. Kleinman's work here stands alongside Maurice Binder's original sequences as a high point in Bond title design, proving that the form could evolve while honoring its history. The London that Bond returns to is a city under siege, not by foreign armies but by its own anxieties about terrorism, aging infrastructure, and political cowardice. M's apartment is shown as a cold, modern space filled with books and papers, but devoid of personal warmth, reflecting her own isolation after decades of service. The inquiry into her leadership is conducted in a wood-paneled government room that feels frozen in time, a relic of a Britain that no longer exists, much like M herself. Gareth Mallory's arguments against M are not villainous but reasonable, making him a more complex antagonist than any one-dimensional bureaucrat. He asks pointed questions about whether an aging woman with fading instincts should be responsible for the nation's security, questions that the film refuses to answer easily. M's defense of herself and MI6 is passionate but unconvincing, suggesting that even she doubts her own relevance in a world of cyberterrorism and drone strikes. The bombing of MI6 headquarters is filmed as a genuine shock, with no musical warning, just the sudden roar of an explosion that sends glass and concrete cascading onto the streets below. M walks through the rubble afterward with a dazed expression, her professional armor shattered as thoroughly as the building she commanded for nearly 2 decades. This attack is personal in a way that Bond villains rarely achieve, because Silva has targeted not a military installation, but the symbolic home of M's identity. The bodies of MI6 employees, including M's driver and her personal assistant, are shown briefly but memorably, reminding the audience that spy games have real human costs. Bond watches the destruction on a television in a remote bar, his face impassive, but his hands trembling slightly, betraying the emotion his expression hides. His decision to return to London is not presented as heroic, but as compulsive, a moth drawn back to a flame that has already burned him once. The physical exam he undergoes in a secret underground facility reveals a body in decline, with elevated liver enzymes, reduced lung capacity, and a shoulder wound that refuses to heal properly. The psychologist who evaluates Bond tells M that he is unfit for duty, a blunt instrument that has been used too many times and is now cracked beyond repair. Yet M reinstates him anyway, not out of logic but out of love, a maternal decision that prioritizes her heart over her head, with consequences that will prove catastrophic for them both. Bond's first meeting with Q in Skyfall subverts the expectations of longtime fans, replacing the elderly quartermaster of previous films with a young, bespectacled hacker who mocks Bond's age and technophobia. Ben Wishaw's Q is barely out of university, his voice still carrying the uncertainty of youth, yet he speaks with authority about his own generation's mastery of digital warfare. The exchange in the National Gallery, in front of JMW Turner's painting The Fighting Temeraire, is loaded with symbolic meaning, as the painting depicts an old warship being towed to its final berth by a modern steam tug. Q explicitly compares Bond to the Temeraire, a once mighty vessel now obsolete, replaced by machines that require less maintenance and no courage. Bond's response, that the old ship is still bloody brilliant, reveals his refusal to accept obsolescence as the end of usefulness. The gadgets Q provides are deliberately underwhelming. A radio transmitter that can be tracked, a Walther PPK with a palm print sensor, and a simple tracking device. This minimalist approach to Bond's equipment forces him to rely on his wits and physical abilities rather than deus ex machina devices, raising the dramatic stakes considerably. When Bond asks for an exploding pen, Q's dismissal of the request as a relic of a less sophisticated age marks a generational divide that the film never fully reconciles. The Turner painting returns later in the film when M quotes Tennyson, another Victorian artifact, suggesting that the old world's art and poetry still have power even if its technology has faded. Q's youthful arrogance leads directly to Silva's escape, as he connects Silva's laptop to the MI6 mainframe despite his own warnings about cybersecurity. This mistake humanizes Q immediately, showing that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and that book learning cannot replace field experience. The relationship between Bond and Q will develop over subsequent films, but in Skyfall it is defined by mutual suspicion, grudgingly evolving into mutual respect. Q's line, "I'll hazard I can do more damage on my laptop sitting in my pajamas before my first cup of Earl Grey than you can do in a year in the field," is the film's clearest statement of the new espionage philosophy. Bond's silent, skeptical reaction tells the audience that he believes otherwise, and the film's third act will prove him right, but only just barely. This tension between old and new remains unresolved at the credits, a deliberate ambiguity that mirrors the real-world uncertainty about whether human intelligence still matters in the age of algorithms. The Shanghai sequence represents Roger Deakins at his most painterly, transforming a conventional action scene into a meditation on light, shadow, and the isolation of modern urban life. Bond arrives in Shanghai not through a glamorous establishing shot, but through a rain-slicked street that could be any city in the world, stripped of exoticism or romance. The skyscraper where he confronts Patrice is under construction, its unfinished state mirroring Bond's own incomplete recovery from his near-death experience. The fight takes place entirely in silhouette, with the characters' faces never fully visible, suggesting that Bond is fighting not a man but a shadow of himself. Neon advertisements for luxury brands flash on the building's exterior, their colors bleeding into the frame like watercolors, creating a dreamscape where commerce and violence coexist uneasily. Patrice's death comes not from Bond's gun, but from his own fall through a glass window, a moment of accidental poetry that underscores the randomness of violence. After Patrice dies, Bond stands alone in the shattered glass, surrounded by advertisements for products he will never buy, a man utterly disconnected from the consumer paradise he nominally protects. The shot of Bond looking out over Shanghai's skyline, his face half-lit by distant neon, captures the loneliness of the spy's existence more effectively than any monologue could. Deakins used custom-built LED panels to create the colored light effects, allowing him to adjust hues and intensities in real time rather than relying on post-production color grading. The result is a sequence that feels simultaneously futuristic and timeless, a cityscape that could exist in 2012 or 2042 with equal plausibility. Bond's exit from the building is almost silent, with only the sound of wind and distant traffic accompanying his footsteps, a deliberate choice to let the visuals carry the emotional weight. This sequence has been studied in film schools around the world as an example of how action can be both thrilling and artful, how violence can be choreographed without glamorizing it. The Shanghai fight lasts less than 2 minutes, yet its images linger in the memory long after the explosions and gunfights of lesser action films have faded. Deakins received an Academy Award nomination for his work on Skyfall, and the Shanghai sequence alone justifies that recognition, representing a high-water mark for cinematography in the Bond franchise. The journey to Macau expands the film's visual vocabulary while deepening its thematic concerns with death, gambling, and the illusions that sustain both espionage and capitalism. The floating casino is reached by a boat that glides through water lit from below by red lanterns, creating an atmosphere that is equal parts beautiful and menacing. Severine appears first as a silhouette, then as a face half hidden by shadow, her eyes reflecting the lights of the casino but revealing nothing of her inner life. The Komodo dragon pit beneath the casino functions as a literal representation of the danger lurking beneath every surface of Bond's world, a reminder that beauty always conceals teeth. Bond's negotiation with Severine is less a seduction than a transaction, both of them recognizing that the other is using whatever tools they possess to survive. When Severine asks Bond if he has ever killed someone in front of a child, her question reveals a backstory of trauma that the film only hints at, respecting her mystery rather than exploiting her pain. The shot of Bond walking through the casino, surrounded by gamblers who never look up from their tables, suggests a world where everyone is so absorbed in their own illusions that they fail to notice the spy in their midst. Severine's white dress against the red and gold of the casino creates a color contrast that draws the eye directly to her, marking her as both prey and potential ally. Bond's protection of Severine from Silva's thugs is efficient but not heroic, a professional obligation rather than a chivalrous rescue. When they finally reach Silva's island, the transition from Macau's crowded casino to the villain's isolated lair mirrors Bond's own journey from the world of human connection to the cold heart of revenge. The abandoned island city, where Silva has established his base, was a real location, a failed resort development in Japan that had never welcomed a single tourist. This choice of location reinforces the theme of obsolescence, as Silva surrounds himself with ruins that mirror his own broken body and spirit. The journey to Macau ultimately leads Bond not to victory but to capture, as Silva has been manipulating him all along, a puppet master who understands Bond better than Bond understands himself. The introduction of Raul Silva is a masterclass in delayed gratification and subverted expectations, as Javier Bardem does not appear until nearly 70 minutes into the film's runtime. When he finally emerges, he does so from darkness, walking toward Bond and Severine with a casual, unhurried gait that suggests absolute confidence in his own superiority. His first words are soft, almost tender, as he welcomes Bond to his home and thanks him for bringing Severine, whom he clearly views as disposable. The long monologue Silva delivers about rats and islands serves multiple purposes simultaneously: exposition, character development, and psychological warfare against Bond. He tells the story of how M betrayed him in Hong Kong, sacrificing him to save 6 other agents, a calculus of death that he has never been able to accept. The disfigurement of his jaw is revealed gradually, first as a shadow, then as a discoloration, finally as a full-on collapse of bone and tissue that is genuinely disturbing. Silva's sexuality is presented as fluid and ambiguous, with Bardem playing the character as someone who uses attraction as a weapon regardless of gender. When he strokes Bond's leg and face, the gesture is less sexual than possessive, as if Bond is a rare artifact that Silva wants to add to his collection. The line "M has a type, doesn't she?" explicitly connects Bond and Silva as 2 products of the same mother figure, 2 children raised by M to be killers. Silva's decision to kill Severine not with a dramatic gesture, but with a single, offhand gunshot demonstrates his complete lack of emotional attachment to anyone or anything. His escape from Bond's capture attempt is not a chase, but a trap, as he has orchestrated every detail of their encounter to ensure his own freedom. The journey to Skyfall transforms the film from urban thriller to rural gothic, as Bond and M leave behind the digital networks of London for the stone and soil of the Scottish Highlands. The landscape photographs beautifully but inhospitably, all grey skies and brown moors and jagged rocks that seem to reject human habitation entirely. Bond drives an aging Range Rover rather than the Aston Martin, a practical vehicle for rough terrain that nonetheless feels like a downgrade from his usual automotive glamour. The conversations between Bond and M during the drive reveal details about his childhood that have never been mentioned in any previous film, including the fact that his parents died in a climbing accident when he was a boy. Skyfall Lodge appears first as a distant smudge on the horizon, then as a collection of decaying stone buildings, finally as a home that has been empty and unloved for decades. Kincaid emerges from the lodge's shadows like a ghost, his weathered face and rough hands suggesting a life lived entirely in this forgotten corner of the world. Albert Finney's performance as Kincaid brings warmth and humor to the final act, his Scottish brogue and earthy jokes providing relief from the accumulating tension. The preparation for Silva's attack becomes a montage of improvisation, as Bond, Kincaid, and M turn the lodge into a fortress using hunting knives, gas canisters, and improvised explosives. Kincaid's line, "I was a gamekeeper all my life. Poachers, thieves, the occasional communist," establishes him as a man who has been defending this place against intruders long before Bond was born. M's admission that she knew about Bond's parents, that she specifically recruited him because of his orphan's lack of attachments, is a moment of painful honesty that Bond absorbs silently. The decision to arm M with a shotgun, despite her trembling hands and failing eyesight, gives her agency in the final battle rather than reducing her to a passive damsel. Skyfall's isolation from the digital world is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness, protecting it from Silva's hacking while leaving it vulnerable to his conventional attack. The lodge's chapel, where M will eventually die, is introduced as a place of childhood memory, where Bond's parents are buried and where he learned to say goodbye to the dead. The journey to Skyfall is ultimately a journey into Bond's own psyche, a confrontation with the boy he was and the man that boy became, mediated by the landscape that shaped them both. The final battle at Skyfall Lodge returns action cinema to its elemental roots, stripping away automatic weapons and computer screens in favor of fire, earth, and cold steel. Bond's use of the family hunting knife, a weapon his father presumably carried, transforms the battle from a professional operation into a personal vendetta. Silva's mercenaries approach the lodge across open ground, their silhouettes dark against the pale Scottish sky, a composition that recalls classic westerns more than spy thrillers. The first explosion is triggered by a gas cooker in the kitchen, a homemade bomb that destroys none of the mercenaries but announces that Bond is willing to burn down his own home to defend it. Kincaid sniping from the upper windows, using an old hunting rifle with a telescopic sight, provides covering fire that is accurate but slow, each shot requiring careful aim and breath control. M's role in the battle is limited but crucial, as she fires a shotgun from a defensive position, her shots more symbolic than lethal, but no less courageous for their inaccuracy. The moment when Bond and Kincaid must retreat from the main house, setting off explosives that collapse the structure behind them, is filmed as a genuine loss rather than a tactical victory. The burning lodge against the dark moor becomes the film's most iconic image, a visual shorthand for the destruction of the old to make way for the new. Silva's arrival at the chapel, where M has taken refuge, transforms the final confrontation into something resembling a religious tableau, with M as the sacrificial figure on an improvised altar. Bond's pursuit of Silva through the burning building is shot with handheld cameras that capture every stumble, every near fall, every desperate gasp for air. The final knife fight between Bond and Silva has none of the choreographed elegance of earlier Bond battles. Only two broken men stabbing each other in a burning chapel, while a dying woman watches. Bond's victory comes not from superior skill, but from superior will, as he drives the knife into Silva's back and twists, an ugly kill that brings him no satisfaction. M's death, occurring off-screen as Bond finishes Silva, is heard rather than seen, her final breath a soft exhalation that the audience must strain to catch. The aftermath, with Bond kneeling beside M's body as the chapel burns around them, is the first time in the franchise's history that Bond has been shown weeping for anyone. This final battle lasts nearly 20 minutes, making it one of the longest action sequences in Bond history. But its pacing is deliberate, allowing moments of quiet between explosions. The film's treatment of mortality extends beyond Bond and M to encompass the entire spy apparatus, suggesting that the very concept of secret intelligence may be dying alongside the people who practice it. Mallory's transformation from bureaucratic antagonist to sympathetic successor mirrors the audience's own journey from suspicion of authority to acceptance of necessary change. The new MI6 headquarters, glimpsed in the film's final shots, is a modern glass building that rejects the monumental stone of its predecessor, embracing transparency over secrecy. Bond's physical and psychological wounds are not healed by the film's end, but simply accepted as permanent, part of a body and mind that will continue to function despite their damage. The decision to promote Eve to the role of Moneypenny, M's personal secretary, returns a beloved character to her classic position while acknowledging that she has earned it through sacrifice rather than inheritance. Q's presence in the final scene, still young and arrogant but slightly humbled by his mistake, suggests that the new generation will learn from its failures rather than repeating them. The new M's first words to Bond, "I sometimes miss the old M as well," acknowledge loss while refusing to wallow in it, a balance that defines the film's attitude toward its own nostalgia. Bond's final line, "With respect, sir, I prefer the old M," is both a tribute to Judi Dench's 17 years in the role and an acceptance that her time has passed. The closing shot of Bond walking through London, his face determined but not joyful, suggests a man who has survived but not triumphed, who will continue because continuing is what he does. Skyfall's ending rejects the traditional Bond resolution of a beautiful woman and a celebratory drink, offering instead the quiet satisfaction of duty performed without expectation of reward. The film's box office success, exceeding $1 billion worldwide, proved that audiences were hungry for this more somber, more psychological take on the character. Critics who had grown weary of the Bond formula after 50 years praised Skyfall for reinvigorating the franchise while respecting its history. The film's influence can be seen in subsequent spy movies from the Mission Impossible series to television shows like The Americans, all of which embrace psychological depth over superficial thrills. Yet Skyfall remains distinct among its imitators because of its willingness to let its hero fail, to let its heroine die, and to let its audience leave the theater without the comfortable certainty that everything will be fine. This refusal of easy answers is what elevates Skyfall from a very good action film to a genuine work of art, one that rewards repeated viewings with new insights each time. The film's legacy, a decade after its release, is that of a masterpiece that changed what audiences expected from a James Bond movie, and perhaps from blockbuster cinema as a whole. The character of Severine represents one of Skyfall's most complex yet underutilized elements, as she embodies the collateral damage of the espionage world that Bond and M have spent decades constructing. Her introduction in Macau, with her silver dress and haunted eyes, immediately signals that she is not a conventional Bond girl, but a wounded survivor trapped in circumstances she cannot escape. The scar on her wrist, visible only in certain lighting, suggests a history of self-harm that the film never explicitly discusses, but allows attentive viewers to notice and interpret. Severine's backstory, that she was taken by Silva from a brothel where she worked as a child, implicates the global sex trade in the larger system of violence that espionage both fights and enables. Her conversation with Bond aboard the casino boat reveals a woman who has learned to read danger in men's eyes, a survival skill that has kept her alive but has not saved her soul. When she asks Bond whether he has ever killed someone in front of a child, the question hangs in the air unanswered, because both of them know the answer is almost certainly yes. The sexual encounter between Bond and Severine aboard the yacht is filmed as a transaction rather than a romance, two damaged people using each other for comfort that neither truly feels. Bond's promise to protect Severine is one he knows he cannot keep, and her death at Silva's hands comes as no surprise to anyone except perhaps Severine herself. The manner of her death, shot in the back of the head while kneeling, is deliberately anticlimactic, denying her the dignity of a heroic sacrifice or even a meaningful last word. Silva's line, "She really was lovely, wasn't she?" spoken over her corpse, reduces her entire existence to a single adjective, a commentary on how the spy genre has historically treated its female characters. Yet the film's decision to kill Severine rather than save her is not misogyny but realism, acknowledging that not every victim can be rescued and not every Bond girl gets a happy ending. Her death serves as a turning point for Bond, hardening his resolve and eliminating any remaining doubt about Silva's evil. But she herself is given no agency in this transformation. The film has been criticized for this treatment of Severine, with some arguing that she exists only to die and motivate Bond, a classic example of fridging in action cinema. Others defend the choice as honest about the dangers faced by women in the criminal underworld, where beauty is currency and death is the only escape. Severine's brief presence in Skyfall leaves an outsized impact precisely because she is given so little screen time, her mystery preserved rather than explained away through tedious exposition. The relationship between M and Mallory evolves throughout the film from adversarial to collegial to something approaching mutual respect, reflecting the possibility that institutional change need not destroy institutional wisdom. Mallory begins as a threat, a former soldier turned politician who believes that oversight and accountability are more important than operational secrecy and individual heroism. His questions at the inquiry are not unfair, and the film takes care to show that his concerns about M's age and judgment have some validity given recent events. When M dismisses Mallory's warnings about budget cuts and political accountability, her arrogance is visible even to those who support her position on principle. The bombing of MI6 changes Mallory's perspective, as he witnesses firsthand the kind of enemy that M has been fighting and the sacrifices her people make daily. His decision to accompany Bond and M to Skyfall, despite having no field experience and no obligation to risk his life, signals a willingness to learn that separates him from conventional bureaucratic villains. During the final battle, Mallory fights with a soldier's competence rather than a spy's cunning, using his military training to hold a defensive position while Bond executes the more theatrical elements of the plan. When M dies in Bond's arms, Mallory stands at a respectful distance, understanding that this moment belongs to the two people who have shared decades of trust and betrayal. His appointment as the new M is presented not as a victory for bureaucracy, but as a compromise between old and new, a recognition that the spy game must change even as it continues. Mallory's first act as M is to protect Bond from the political fallout of M's death, shielding him from inquiry and allowing him to return to the field. The final scene between Bond and Mallory establishes a new dynamic, one based on mutual suspicion that may someday become mutual respect, much as Bond's relationship with the original M evolved over 17 years. Ralph Fiennes brings a weary dignity to Mallory, suggesting a man who has seen combat, served in government, and learned that neither glory nor power provides the satisfaction he once sought. The decision to make Mallory a former soldier rather than a career politician adds depth to his character, explaining why he understands Bond's loyalty even when his political masters cannot. Mallory's willingness to lie to the inquiry about M's final moments, claiming that she died a hero's death rather than a wounded animal's, reveals his capacity for the same moral flexibility that defined M at her best. By the film's end, Mallory has earned the audience's respect not through heroism, but through decency, a quieter virtue that may prove more valuable in the years ahead. The symbolism of the Komodo dragon pit extends beyond mere exotic danger to comment on the nature of Bond's world, where ancient predators still lurk beneath modern surfaces. The dragons themselves are living fossils, creatures that have survived unchanged for millions of years while other species evolved or went extinct around them. Bond's encounter with them in Macau forces him to confront a form of danger that cannot be hacked, bribed, or reasoned with, only avoided or confronted directly. The pit is located beneath the casino, a physical representation of the violence that underwrites all forms of luxury and entertainment in the globalized economy. Severine's knowledge of the dragons, her ability to navigate the pit without being attacked, suggests her own long acquaintance with danger and death. When Bond uses a palm print scanner to unlock a gun, the gadget's failure to recognize his print forces him to rely on physical strength rather than technology to escape. The dragons do not attack Bond because he moves with purpose and without fear, a lesson about predator psychology that applies equally to the human villains he faces throughout the film. Silva's control over the dragons, his ability to use them as a threat against his enemies, mirrors his control over Severine and his other human assets, all of whom he keeps in a state of constant fear. The image of Bond standing on a narrow walkway above a pit of reptiles, his gun useless, his gadgets failing, represents the film's thesis that the spy's ultimate resource is not technology but nerve. When Bond finally escapes the pit, he does so not through cleverness but through brute determination, pulling himself up by a chain while dragons snap at his heels. This escape foreshadows the film's final act, where Bond will again strip away technology and rely on physical courage to defeat an enemy who cannot be outsmarted. The dragons make no further appearance in the film, but their symbolic weight carries forward, reminding the audience that civilization is a thin veneer over a much older, much crueler reality. Bond's ability to face the dragons without flinching distinguishes him from ordinary men, just as his ability to face Silva distinguishes him from ordinary spies. The pit sequence lasts less than 3 minutes, but establishes a metaphor that the film will return to again and again, each time asking what ancient predator lurks beneath the current scene's surface. The character of Kincaid serves as a bridge between Bond's past and his present, representing the Scotland that raised him and the man he might have become if he had never left Skyfall. Albert Finney brings a gruff warmth to the role, playing Kincaid as a man who has outlived his era but refuses to apologize for it, much like Bond himself. Kincaid's knowledge of Skyfall's hidden passages, secret rooms, and structural weaknesses comes from decades of maintaining the estate, not from any espionage training or military experience. His relationship with Bond is that of a surrogate uncle rather than a father, close enough to care but distant enough to avoid the emotional complications of actual parenthood. The banter between Kincaid and Bond during the preparation for Silva's attack provides some of the film's only moments of genuine humor, relieving tension without undermining the seriousness of their situation. Kincaid's refusal to leave Skyfall, even when Bond orders him to evacuate, demonstrates a loyalty to place that Bond himself has never been able to feel. The line, "I've taken this land from poachers and worse for 60 years. I'm not leaving it to that lanky streak of piss," establishes Kincaid's character in a single sentence, a masterclass in efficient screenwriting. During the battle, Kincaid fights with improvised weapons and homemade traps, his methods more creative than Bond's, but no less effective against Silva's professional mercenaries. The moment when Kincaid saves Bond's life, shooting a mercenary who has Bond in his sights, reverses the expected dynamic of elderly sidekick and young hero, giving Kincaid genuine agency in the battle's outcome. His survival through the final explosion, emerging from the burning lodge covered in soot but otherwise unharmed, suggests that some things from Bond's past can be preserved even as others burn away. Kincaid's final scene, watching the lodge collapse from a safe distance, is wordless but expressive, his weathered face showing grief for the home he has defended for 6 decades. The original plan to have Sean Connery play Kincaid would have created an entirely different film, one about an aging actor confronting his own legacy rather than a gamekeeper defending his home. Mendes's decision to cast Finney instead preserved the character's integrity, allowing Kincaid to exist as himself rather than as a meta-commentary on the Bond franchise. Finney's performance grounds the film's final act in emotional reality, reminding the audience that Skyfall is not just Bond's home, but a real place with real history and real people who have loved it. Kincaid's survival offers the film's only uncomplicated happy ending, a small mercy in a story otherwise defined by loss and grief. The London Underground chase sequence represents a deliberate inversion of classic Bond action set pieces, replacing exotic locations with the mundane infrastructure of everyday British life. Silva's hacking of the subway system turns a symbol of modern urban convenience into a weapon of mass destruction, a train derailed not by explosives but by software commands. The image of a train crashing through a concrete barrier, its cars folding like an accordion, is filmed with practical effects rather than CGI, lending visceral weight to the destruction. Bond's pursuit of Silva through the tube tunnels requires him to navigate environments that real Londoners use daily, grounding the fantasy of espionage in recognizable reality. The abandoned station where Silva has established a temporary base is based on real disused parts of the London Underground, spaces that exist beneath the city but remain invisible to its inhabitants. When Bond and M run through a tunnel as an oncoming train approaches, the sequence uses the confined space to generate claustrophobic tension that no amount of open-air running could match. Silva's ability to control the train's movements, opening and closing doors and changing routes at will, demonstrates the vulnerability of any system that depends on networked computers. Bond's decision to shoot out the glass ceiling, creating an escape route onto a double-decker bus, requires him to think vertically as well as horizontally, using the city's three-dimensional geography to his advantage. The bus that catches Bond and M is empty except for its driver, suggesting a city that has emptied itself in fear of the attacks, a London that no longer feels safe even in daylight. Silva's escape through the tunnels, disappearing into darkness as Bond struggles to reach M, denies the audience the satisfaction of a clean victory or even a clear defeat. The chase ends not with a confrontation, but with an escape, Silva vanishing into the tube network like a ghost returning to the underworld from which he emerged. This sequence has been compared to the subway chase in The French Connection, another film about an aging hero pursuing a younger, more technologically adept enemy through a city's underground arteries. The use of the London Underground, a system that survived the Blitz and generations of terrorist threats, being turned against its own protectors, adds a layer of tragic irony to the destruction. Bond's familiarity with the tube network, his ability to navigate it without maps or directions, marks him as a Londoner rather than a tourist, a man who belongs to the city he protects. The chase sequence lasts approximately 7 minutes, but feels longer because of the relentless tension, each corner hiding a potential threat, and each tunnel leading deeper into danger. The psychological evaluation scene in the MI6 bunker provides the film's most explicit diagnosis of Bond's character, listing his flaws with clinical detachment that contrasts sharply with M's emotional loyalty. The evaluator, a woman whose name the audience never learns, speaks about Bond as if he were a broken machine rather than a human being, a dehumanization that Bond himself seems to accept. The specific diagnosis of pathological rejection of authority based on unresolved childhood trauma pins Bond's entire career on the death of his parents, a reduction that is both accurate and incomplete. Bond's physical failures during the evaluation, his inability to complete the pull-up test or maintain his balance on the medical examination table, demonstrate a body that has been pushed past its natural limits. The evaluator's recommendation that Bond be permanently removed from field duty is based on evidence rather than emotion, making M's decision to overrule her both heroic and irresponsible. Bond's silence during the evaluation, his refusal to defend himself or explain his behavior, suggests a man who has accepted his own brokenness and no longer cares to hide it. The evaluator's mention of Bond's coping mechanisms, a clinical term for his drinking, gambling, and casual sex, pathologizes behaviors that previous Bond films had presented as glamorous. When Bond finally speaks, asking only, "What else have you got?" his tone is not defensive but curious, as if he is genuinely interested in the catalog of his own failures. The scene takes place in a sterile white room, all fluorescent lights and stainless steel, a deliberate contrast to the warm wood and soft shadows of M's office. Bond's physical posture during the evaluation, slouched and defeated, is the opposite of the confident, commanding presence he projects in the field. M's entrance into the room, her refusal to accept the evaluator's conclusions, transforms the scene from clinical assessment into emotional confrontation. The evaluator's warning that reinstating Bond would be dangerous for everyone proves prophetic by the film's end, though not in the way she intended. Bond's gratitude to M for reinstating him is expressed not in words, but in a single look, a brief softening of his features that reveals the depth of his feeling beneath his stoic surface. This scene, lasting barely 3 minutes, contains more psychological insight into Bond's character than any other film in the franchise's 50-year history. The decision to place this evaluation immediately before Bond's return to active duty creates a structural tension between medical reality and heroic necessity that the film never fully resolves. The Shanghai skyscraper fight sequence represents a high point of visual storytelling because it communicates everything the audience needs to know through images rather than dialogue or exposition. Bond's ascent through the unfinished building, climbing scaffolding and crossing open beams, establishes his physical capability while also revealing his vulnerability to falls and accidents. The advertisements projected onto the building's exterior change throughout the sequence, their colors shifting from cool blues to warm reds to cold whites, reflecting the emotional temperature of each moment. Patrice's face is never clearly seen during the fight, a choice that transforms him from a specific villain into a representation of all the enemies Bond has killed over decades of service. The weapons used in the fight are improvised from the construction site itself, pipes and cables and loose boards, suggesting that Bond can turn any environment into an arsenal. When Bond finally kills Patrice, the impact of the fall shatters a glass floor, creating a shower of fragments that catch the colored light like frozen rain. The sound design during the fight emphasizes the physicality of each blow, with bone-crunching impacts and gasping breaths replacing the usual soundtrack of orchestral swells and gunfire. Bond's examination of Patrice's body after the kill is methodical and emotionless, the work of a professional who has done this hundreds of times before. The discovery of the casino chip in Patrice's pocket, leading Bond to Macau and eventually to Silva, transforms a moment of violence into a plot advancement without feeling forced or convenient. Bond's exit from the building, walking through a lobby filled with oblivious businessmen and tourists, comments on the invisibility of violence in the modern city. The Shanghai sequence has been analyzed by cinematographers around the world as a masterclass in lighting, with Deakins using practical sources rather than studio setups to create his effects. The fight lasts less than 2 minutes but contains more visual information than many entire action films, each frame packed with meaning and mood. Bond's silhouette against the glowing advertisements, his outline crisp against the diffuse light, has become one of the most reproduced images from any Bond film. The sequence cost approximately $5 million to film, most of which went to constructing the skyscraper set and installing the LED panels that created the advertising effects. Deakins has said in interviews that the Shanghai sequence was the most technically challenging of his career, requiring new approaches to lighting that had never been attempted before. The final shot of Bond looking out over Shanghai, his face half-lit by distant neon, captures the loneliness of the spy's existence more effectively than any monologue could. The film's treatment of British national identity is complex and often contradictory, celebrating traditional values while acknowledging their limitations in a globalized world. The destruction of MI6, a building that represents British intelligence and resilience, feels like an attack on the nation itself rather than merely on an agency. Bond's defense of Skyfall, his childhood home in Scotland, links national identity to personal history in ways that complicate simple patriotism. The use of the Union Jack is restrained throughout the film, appearing only in subtle ways such as a flag on a desk or a pin on a lapel, avoiding jingoism while still asserting Britishness. M's recitation of Tennyson, a quintessentially English poet, asserts the continuing relevance of British culture even as British power wanes on the world stage. The contrast between London's modern architecture and Skyfall's ancient stone represents the tension between Britain's future and its past, a tension that the film refuses to resolve. Silva's attack on the public inquiry, a government hearing about MI6's future, represents an assault on British democracy itself, not just on the spy agency. Bond's use of the Aston Martin DB5, a car that represents 1960s British cool, suggests that nostalgia can be a weapon as well as a weakness. The character of Mallory, a former soldier who becomes the new M, embodies the British ideal of the amateur gentleman who rises to meet extraordinary circumstances. The Scottish setting of the final act emphasizes Britain's internal diversity, reminding audiences that the nation is composed of distinct regions with their own histories and loyalties. Kincaid's thick Scottish accent, almost incomprehensible to non-British audiences, asserts regional identity against the homogenizing force of London-centric espionage. The film's release in 2012, the year of the London Olympics and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, tapped into a moment of heightened British self-reflection and patriotic feeling. Yet Skyfall is not a simple celebration of Britishness, as it shows British institutions as corrupt, British politicians as cowardly, and British cities as vulnerable to attack. The film's ultimate message about national identity is that Britain, like Bond himself, is old, battered, and diminished, but still capable of courage when courage is required. This nuanced patriotism, skeptical of institutions but loyal to values, explains much of the film's enormous success in the United Kingdom, where it remains the highest-grossing Bond film of all time. The death of M in Bond's arms functions as the film's emotional climax and as a symbolic passing of the torch from one era of the franchise to the next. Judi Dench had played M for 17 years, appearing in 7 Bond films across 2 different actors' tenures, making her death a genuinely historic moment for the series. The chapel where M dies is lit by firelight from the burning lodge, casting flickering shadows that make the scene feel ancient and ritualistic rather than modern and clinical. Bond's face as M dies is a mask of controlled grief, his jaw tight and his eyes wet but not weeping, a performance of masculine restraint that Daniel Craig executes perfectly. M's final words are not about Silva or MI6 or the future of British intelligence, but about Bond himself, a last expression of maternal love that she could never say aloud while alive. The line, "I did get one thing right," refers to her decision to trust Bond, to recruit him despite his psychological damage, and to stand by him against all professional advice. Bond's response, a simple, "I know," acknowledges her love without returning it in kind, a choice that respects the complexity of their relationship. The silence after M's death is absolute, with no music, no dialogue, and no sound effects except the crackling of the burning chapel around them. Bond's decision to carry M's body out of the chapel rather than leave it to burn demonstrates a respect for the dead that he has rarely shown to his enemies. The image of Bond walking through flames with M in his arms, her white dress stained with blood and soot, evokes religious iconography of pietà and sacrifice. M's death solves the narrative problem of Judi Dench's advancing age and desire to leave the franchise, while also providing emotional weight that no villain's defeat could match. The scene has been compared to the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, another mentor figure whose sacrifice allows the hero to continue the fight with renewed purpose. Dench has said in interviews that filming M's death was emotionally exhausting, requiring multiple takes because she and Craig kept crying during the scene. The decision to have M die in a chapel, surrounded by images of Christian sacrifice, adds religious overtones to her death that the film never explicitly discusses. Bond's inability to save M, despite his best efforts and his considerable skills, teaches him a lesson about the limits of heroism that will inform his character in subsequent films. M's death is the only time in the Daniel Craig era that Bond fails to protect someone he loves, a failure that will haunt him through the remainder of his tenure in the role. The film's sound design, supervised by Stuart Wilson, deserves special attention for its contribution to Skyfall's atmosphere and emotional impact. The absence of music during key sequences, such as M's death and Bond's recovery in Scotland, creates a vacuum that heightens the audience's attention to natural sounds. The gunshots in Skyfall sound different from those in previous Bond films, heavier and more echoing, as if each bullet carries more weight than its predecessors. The crackle of fire in the final act, recorded from actual burning buildings rather than created in a studio, gives the destruction of Skyfall Lodge a documentary authenticity. Silva's voice is often mixed slightly lower than other characters, forcing the audience to lean forward and pay closer attention to his words, increasing the sense of threat he represents. The sound of Bond's fall into the river in the pre-title sequence, a muffled splash followed by the rush of water over his body, immerses the audience in his near-death experience. The London Underground sequence uses the real sounds of trains passing through tunnels, recorded on location and mixed with the actor's dialogue and the score. Thomas Newman's score incorporates electronic elements that represent Silva's digital threat, contrasting with orchestral passages that represent Bond and M's traditional world. The silence between Adele's vocal phrases in the title song, the spaces where her voice stops and the orchestra continues alone, creates a sense of yearning and loss. The sound of the Komodo dragons hissing and snapping in the Macau pit was created by mixing recordings of actual Komodo dragons with sounds of rattlesnakes and alligators. Bond's Walther PPK, a weapon known for its relatively quiet report, is mixed to sound louder and more authoritative than it would in reality, emphasizing the gun's symbolic importance. The explosion of MI6 headquarters uses a combination of low-frequency bass that the audience feels in their chests and high-frequency shattering that they hear in their ears. Silva's cyanide capsule, which fails to kill him and instead destroys his jaw, makes a wet, grinding sound that has caused audience members to look away from the screen in discomfort. The sound design of Skyfall received an Academy Award nomination and is widely considered among the best in the Bond franchise's history. Wilson has said that his goal was to make every sound in the film feel earned rather than manufactured, grounded in physical reality even when the situations were fantastical. The theme of fatherhood runs throughout Skyfall as a counterpoint to the more obvious maternal dynamics, though it remains largely implicit rather than explicit. Bond's own father died when Bond was a boy, leaving him without a male role model during his formative years, an absence that shapes his entire adult identity. Kincaid serves as a surrogate father figure during the final act, providing the practical knowledge and emotional support that Bond's biological father never could. The Aston Martin DB5, which belonged to Bond's father in the film's backstory, represents a paternal inheritance that Bond has kept but never fully appreciated until now. Silva's relationship with M has maternal overtones, but his relationship with Bond has fraternal undertones, two sons of the same mother competing for her approval. The character of Mallory, who becomes the new M, occupies a paternal role in the film's final scenes, offering Bond protection and guidance that no other male character provides. Bond's decision to return to Skyfall, his father's house, represents a pilgrimage to the site of his paternal legacy, an attempt to understand the man whose death defined his childhood. The hunting knife Bond uses to kill Silva belonged to his father, making the final kill not just an act of vengeance, but an act of inherited violence passed down across generations. The chapel where M dies is also where Bond's parents are buried, linking the two deaths in the film's geography as well as its themes. Kincaid's stories about Bond's father, brief anecdotes about hunting and fishing and father-son bonding, provide the only glimpses the audience ever gets of the man who made Bond. Bond's inability to save either of his parental figures, his mother in M and his symbolic father in Kincaid's home, repeats the trauma of his childhood on a larger scale. The film's resolution, with Bond standing alone on a rooftop overlooking London, shows a man who has accepted his orphanhood and learned to stand without parental support. This acceptance of fatherlessness distinguishes Skyfall from earlier Bond films, which either ignored Bond's origins or treated them as irrelevant to his adult identity. The paternal theme in Skyfall is quieter than the maternal theme, less discussed by critics, but no less essential to understanding Bond's psychological journey. By the film's end, Bond has made peace with the father who died, the mother who betrayed him, and the orphan who survived them both. The critical and commercial success of Skyfall reshaped the Bond franchise and influenced action cinema for years following its release. The film's billion-dollar box office gross, the first for any Bond film, proved that sophisticated, character-driven action could compete with the franchise films that dominated the early 2010s. Critics who had dismissed Bond as a relic of a less enlightened era praised Skyfall for its psychological depth, its visual beauty, and its willingness to take risks with beloved characters. The film's Academy Awards, including Best Original Score and Best Sound Editing, represented the franchise's greatest awards success since Goldfinger in 1964. Skyfall's influence can be seen in subsequent Bond films, particularly Spectre and No Time to Die, which continued the exploration of Bond's psychology and backstory. The success of Skyfall also influenced non-Bond films, with studios seeking to replicate its combination of practical action, emotional weight, and visual artistry. Sam Mendes, originally considered an unusual choice to direct a Bond film, became one of the franchise's most celebrated directors, returning for the follow-up Spectre. Daniel Craig's performance as Bond, already respected after Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, reached new heights of critical acclaim, with many calling it the best Bond performance since Sean Connery. Judi Dench's final appearance as M was widely praised, with many critics arguing that her performance was the film's greatest asset, even over Craig's Bond. The introduction of new actors in classic roles, including Ben Whishaw as Q and Naomi Harris as Moneypenny, revitalized the supporting cast for future installments. Skyfall's success at the British box office, where it became the highest-grossing film of all time, reflected the film's particular resonance with UK audiences. The film's release in IMAX venues, a first for the Bond franchise, set a precedent that all subsequent Bond films would follow. Skyfall's Blu-ray and DVD sales were also strong, with the home video release including extensive behind-the-scenes features that documented the film's production. The film's legacy has only grown in the decade since its release, with many critics now ranking it among the greatest Bond films ever made, alongside Goldfinger and From Russia with Love. Skyfall proved that a 50-year-old franchise could still surprise audiences, still take artistic risks, and still produce work that stands alongside the best cinema of its era. The pre-title sequence in Istanbul functions as a complete short film within the larger narrative, establishing themes of trust, betrayal, and mortality that will echo throughout the remaining runtime. Bond's opening walk through the dark corridor, his face half illuminated by emergency lighting, immediately signals that this version of 007 operates in moral ambiguity rather than clear-cut heroism. The mission to recover the hard drive is presented as routine, another day at the office for a man who has performed similar tasks hundreds of times without incident. When Bond encounters the mercenary Patrice in a crowded market, the film takes care to show civilians scattering in terror, reminding the audience that spy violence has innocent victims. The motorcycle chase across Istanbul's rooftops showcases Daniel Craig's commitment to practical stunts, with the actor performing many of his own jumps and slides. Bond's decision to jump onto the moving train, despite the obvious danger, demonstrates a willingness to risk everything for the mission that defines his entire career. The fight atop the train is brutally physical, lacking any choreographed elegance in favor of desperate, ugly exchanges that could end either man's life at any moment. When Eve receives M's order to take the shot, her hesitation is visible even through the sniper rifle's scope, her finger trembling on the trigger. M's command comes after a pause that lasts only seconds but feels like minutes, suggesting internal debate that she will never fully acknowledge. The bullet strikes Bond in the shoulder, a placement that might be survivable, but the fall into the river below makes survival unlikely. Bond's body sinking through dark water, bubbles escaping from his mouth, creates an image of death that the film will subvert only moments later. The flatline on the medical monitor, heard but not seen directly, confirms what the visuals have already suggested. James Bond is dead. Yet the title sequence that follows, with its images of drowning and sinking, keeps Bond present as a memory even as the narrative declares him gone. This pre-title sequence runs nearly 15 minutes, longer than any previous Bond cold open, because Sam Mendes understood that the audience needed to feel Bond's death as a genuine loss. The decision to kill Bond before the title song even begins was a gamble that paid off, establishing Skyfall as a film willing to break franchise rules in service of emotional truth. The title song Skyfall, performed by Adele, operates on multiple levels simultaneously, functioning as a standalone pop hit, a narrative summary, and a musical homage to the Bond films of the 1960s. The song's orchestral arrangement, featuring a full string section and brass instruments, directly recalls the work of John Barry, who composed 11 Bond scores between 1962 and 1987. Adele's vocal performance is restrained by her standards, holding back the full power of her voice until the final chorus, mirroring the film's own slow-burn approach to emotional release. The lyrics, "Let the sky fall, when it crumbles, we will stand tall," can be interpreted as Bond's promise to M, Silva's threat to destroy everything, or the franchise's determination to survive its 50th anniversary. The line "Face it all together" emphasizes the film's central theme of loyalty, suggesting that Bond and M's relationship is the only thing worth protecting in a world of collapsing institutions. The song's music video, directed by Sam Mendes himself, intercuts Adele's performance with images from the film, creating a dialogue between song and story that enriches both. Skyfall won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, making it the first Bond theme to win an Oscar since Writing's Wall, from The Spy Who Loved Me in 1978. Adele co-wrote the song with Paul Epworth, who had previously produced her album 21, and the collaboration brought a pop sensibility to the Bond formula that attracted younger audiences. The song's bridge, with its descending chord progression and Adele's soaring upper register, provides the emotional climax that the verses have been building toward across 3 minutes. Skyfall reached #1 on charts around the world, including the UK Singles Chart and the US Billboard Hot 100, a rare achievement for a film theme. The song's success helped drive the film's box office performance, with many audience members attending specifically to hear the song in its theatrical context. Adele has said in interviews that writing Skyfall was intimidating because of the legacy of Shirley Bassey, whose 3 Bond themes remain among the most beloved in the franchise's history. The song's music video has been viewed over 1 billion times on YouTube, making it one of the most watched Bond-related videos on the platform. Skyfall. The song is so closely associated with the film that it has become almost impossible to hear one without thinking of the other, a sign of successful integration between music and narrative. The song's final line, "We will stand tall," serves as both a prediction of Bond's survival and a declaration of the franchise's enduring relevance. The cinematography of Roger Deakins transforms every location into a character, with Shanghai, Macau, London, and Scotland each possessing distinct visual identities that reflect their narrative functions. Deakins' use of silhouettes in the Shanghai sequence, with Bond and Patrice reduced to dark shapes against glowing advertisements, emphasizes the anonymity of modern urban violence. The floating casino in Macau is lit from below by red lanterns reflected in black water, creating an atmosphere that is equal parts beautiful and menacing, seductive and dangerous. The abandoned island where Silva has established his base was filmed in Japan at a failed resort development, its empty buildings and overgrown gardens visually representing the villain's own decay. London in Skyfall is drained of color, all grays and blues and muted greens, suggesting a city still recovering from the trauma of the MI6 bombing. The underground bunker where MI6 relocates after the attack is lit with cold fluorescent tubes, creating a sterile environment that feels more like a morgue than a command center. Skyfall Lodge in Scotland is photographed in natural light, with clouds moving across the moors and rain falling on stone, grounding the final act in elemental reality. Deakins used custom-built LED panels to create the colored light effects in Shanghai, allowing him to adjust hues and intensities in real time rather than relying on post-production color grading. The fire that consumed Skyfall Lodge at the film's climax was a practical effect, with the production actually burning a full-scale replica of the building on a Scottish moor. Deakins' preference for practical lighting over digital effects gives Skyfall a tactile quality that many modern action films lack, making every scene feel physically present. The contrast between the warm, golden light of Macau and the cold, blue light of London visually separates Bond's 2 worlds, the glamorous and the professional. Deakins received his 10th Academy Award nomination for his work on Skyfall, though he would not win until his 14th nomination for 1917 in 2020. The cinematographer has said that the Shanghai sequence was the most technically challenging of his career, requiring new approaches to lighting that had never been attempted before. The visual grammar of Skyfall, with its careful compositions and deliberate color palettes, has influenced action cinema more broadly, with many subsequent films attempting to replicate Deakins' style. Every frame of Skyfall rewards close analysis, with details and meanings that reveal themselves only after multiple viewings, a testament to Deakins' mastery of his craft. The character of Q in Skyfall represents a deliberate generational shift from previous portrayals, replacing the elderly quartermaster of earlier films with a young hacker barely out of university. Ben Whishaw's casting was controversial among longtime fans, who questioned whether such a young actor could command the authority that the role required. Whishaw's performance answers this criticism by playing Q as arrogant rather than wise, confident in his digital expertise but inexperienced in the human realities of espionage. Q's introduction in the National Gallery, standing before Turner's painting The Fighting Temeraire, immediately establishes his symbolic function as a representative of the new replacing the old. The painting depicts an aging warship being towed to its final berth by a modern steam tug, a visual metaphor for Q's relationship with Bond throughout the film. Q's line, "I'll hazard I can do more damage on my laptop sitting in my pajamas before my first cup of Earl Grey than you can do in a year in the field," is the film's clearest statement of the new espionage philosophy. Bond's response, a skeptical silence followed by a request for an exploding pen, reveals his resistance to this philosophy and his preference for tangible, physical weapons. The gadgets Q provides are deliberately underwhelming: a radio transmitter, a standard-issue Walther PPK, and a simple tracking device. This minimalist approach forces Bond to rely on his wits and physical abilities rather than deus ex machina devices, raising the dramatic stakes considerably. Q's decision to connect Silva's laptop to the MI6 mainframe, despite his own warnings about cybersecurity, is a catastrophic error that humanizes him immediately. The mistake shows that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and that book learning cannot replace field experience, no matter how many degrees Q possesses. Q's apology to M after Silva's escape is brief but sincere, his arrogance replaced by genuine shame at having failed his first major test. The relationship between Bond and Q evolves across the film from mutual suspicion to grudging respect, setting up a dynamic that will continue in subsequent installments. By the film's end, Q has learned that the old ways still have value, just as Bond has learned that the new ways cannot be ignored. Whishaw's Q remains a fan favorite among the Skyfall supporting cast, with many praising his performance as a successful modernization of a beloved character. The Aston Martin DB5 sequence serves as a nostalgic interlude that honors the franchise's past while also commenting on the dangers of living in that past. Bond retrieves the car from his garage in Scotland, where it has been stored under a dusty tarp, untouched for years if not decades. The DB5 is introduced with the same musical cue that accompanied its first appearance in Goldfinger, a deliberate quotation that rewards longtime fans. Bond's conversation with Kincaid about the car establishes that it belonged to Bond's father, making it an inheritance as well as a vehicle. The gadgetry of the DB5, including the ejector seat, the machine guns, and the oil slick dispenser, is presented as charmingly obsolete rather than practically useful. When Bond activates the ejector seat to launch a pursuing mercenary, the move works exactly as designed, proving that old technology can still be effective in the right hands. The car chase through the Scottish moors is slower and more deliberate than the franchise's usual vehicle sequences, reflecting the DB5's age and Bond's own diminished physical condition. Bond's decision to use the DB5 as a distraction, driving it toward the enemy while he and M escape on foot, sacrifices a piece of his personal history for the mission. The destruction of the DB5, which explodes after taking multiple rocket hits, is filmed as a genuine loss, with Bond watching the fire from a distance. Sam Mendes has said that destroying the DB5 was a difficult decision, as the car is beloved by fans and represents the franchise's golden age. The sequence acknowledges the emotional attachment that audiences have to the DB5, while also arguing that nostalgia cannot be allowed to paralyze progress. Bond's survival without the car, walking away from the explosion on foot, suggests that the man matters more than the machine, no matter how iconic the machine may be. The DB5 would return in subsequent Bond films, including Spectre and No Time to Die, proving that the franchise cannot fully let go of its past. For Skyfall, however, the destruction of the car serves as a necessary sacrifice, a symbol of the old world burning away to make room for the new. The DB5 sequence lasts approximately 5 minutes, but contains more emotional weight than many entire action films, a testament to the car's cultural significance. The London locations chosen for Skyfall emphasize the city's duality, its simultaneous status as a global financial capital and a collection of ancient neighborhoods with distinct identities. The MI6 headquarters on the River Thames, a real building that has appeared in Bond films since 1995, is shown from angles that emphasize its vulnerability rather than its imposing grandeur. The government inquiry where M faces her political accusers was filmed in a real Whitehall building, its wood paneling and high ceilings suggesting centuries of bureaucratic tradition. Bond's return to London takes him through areas that tourists rarely see, including the underground bunker beneath the Ministry of Defense and the back alleys of Whitehall. The scene where Bond meets Q in the National Gallery places the characters before Turner's The Fighting Temeraire, a painting that hangs in the real gallery and carries its full symbolic weight. The London Underground sequence uses real tube stations, including Charing Cross and Westminster, grounding the fantasy of espionage in locations that Londoners use daily. The abandoned station where Silva has established a temporary base is based on the real disused Down Street station, which served as a bunker for Winston Churchill during World War II. Bond's escape onto a double-decker bus, shooting out the glass ceiling of the tube station to reach street level, uses a bus that is identical to those in service across London. The final scene of Bond standing on a rooftop overlooking the Thames, with the Houses of Parliament and the London Eye visible in the background, asserts Bond's place in the city's geography. The decision to film on location rather than on studio sets gives Skyfall a documentary authenticity that distinguishes it from earlier Bond films. The London of Skyfall is not a glamorous postcard but a living city, with all the grit and complexity that implies. When Silva attacks the public inquiry, the hearing room's location in a real government building makes the violence feel more immediate and threatening. The production was granted unprecedented access to London locations, including the MI6 building and the National Gallery, due to the film's cultural significance. The London sequences in Skyfall have been praised by critics for their authenticity, with many noting that the city feels like a character rather than a backdrop. By grounding its fantasy in real locations, Skyfall achieves a level of verisimilitude that enhances its emotional impact and thematic complexity. The theme of aging permeates every aspect of Skyfall, from Bond's failing body to M's forced retirement to the obsolete technology that defines the film's visual language. Bond's physical examination reveals a man whose body has been pushed past its natural limits, with elevated liver enzymes, reduced lung capacity, and a shoulder wound that refuses to heal. The pull-up test that Bond fails, struggling to complete even a single repetition, is a humiliating moment for a character defined by physical prowess. M's trembling hands, visible during close-up shots of her signing documents or holding a gun, suggest a woman whose body is betraying her even as her mind remains sharp. Silva's disfigured jaw, the result of a failed suicide attempt after torture, represents aging as disfigurement, a visible marker of time's passage that cannot be hidden. The Aston Martin DB5, a car from the 1960s, is shown as a beautiful but outdated machine, its gadgets amusing rather than impressive to contemporary eyes. Kincaid, the aging gamekeeper, moves slowly and requires rest between exertions, his body as weathered as the stone walls of Skyfall Lodge. The MI6 headquarters, a building from the 1990s, is destroyed by a cyber attack that its aging infrastructure was never designed to withstand. The film's villains are not youthful revolutionaries but aging Avengers, Silva a former agent destroyed by time and betrayal. The public inquiry into M's leadership is driven by concerns about her age, with politicians questioning whether an elderly woman can respond to modern threats. Bond's victory over Silva comes not through superior speed or strength, but through superior endurance, an older man outlasting a slightly younger one. The film's final image, of Bond standing on a rooftop overlooking London, shows a man who has accepted his aging rather than fighting it. Skyfall refuses the easy solution of Bond discovering a miracle cure or M reclaiming her youthful vigor, insisting that aging is irreversible and must be faced honestly. The film's treatment of aging is unusual for action cinema, which typically ignores or reverses the effects of time on its heroes. By confronting aging directly, Skyfall achieves a level of emotional realism that distinguishes it from the broader franchise and from the action genre as a whole.